After a 2-month delay, the White House on Wednesday announced details of new regulations to implement its policy towards Cuba, curtailing 3 years of closer relations between the two former Cold War foes. Under the new rules, Americans will be banned from doing business with a restricted list of 180 entities tied to the Cuban military, mostly tied to the tourism sector, including hotels, marinas, and several store chains, according to the new regulations published Wednesday. It also includes 2 rum makers, Ron Caney and Ron Varadero, as well as a local soda Tropicola. But there was no sanction on Cuba's top 2 rums, Havana Club and Santiago de Cuba. The new policy imposes restrictions on Americans going to Cuba as tourists, and seeks to prevent U.S. dollars from falling into the hands of the Cuban military, which runs much of the island's tourism sector, officials told reporters in a White House conference call. We have strengthened our Cuba policies to channel economic activity away from the Cuban military and to encourage the government to move toward greater political and economic freedom for the Cuban people, said Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin. The new rules were met with anger from travel firms doing business with Cuba, as well as supporters of better relations with Cuba. Opponents of the Cuban government were also disappointed the measures weren't tougher. Others were simply left scratching their heads wondering how the restricted list would be enforced. It meets the threshold of creating anxiety for the Cuban government, which is the overwhelming goal, said John Kavulik, with the U.S. Cuba Trade and Economic Council. But the next stages of this will be how it's enforced, he added. In June, President Donald Trump visited Miami to announce his new Cuba policy to great fanfare, offering harsh words about the island's communist leadership and the militarization of its government, as well as what he considered to be President Barack Obama's foolishly one-sided policy of closer engagement. However, for all Trump's bluster, the new policy keeps in place almost all of Obama's legacy-making policy of normalization with Cuba, which began in December 2014. That includes the restoration of diplomatic relations after 54 years, the removal of Cuba from a list of state sponsors of terrorism, as well as the resumption of regular airline operations and allowing cruise ships to sail to the once forbidden island. Mojitas not affected. The new policy mostly targets Cuba's Ministry of Interior, which owns a wide range of companies, and the Armed Forces Business Enterprises Group, GAESA, a Cuban conglomerate involved in all sectors of the economy including tourism. But most of Havana's bars and restaurants belong to Cuba's Ministry of Tourism, which is not affected by the new rules. That means that fans of Ernest Hemingway's famous Havana watering holes will still be able to sip their mojitas in La Bodeguita and daiquiris in El Floridita. The new rules, which take effect Thursday, won't limit visits to the island by Cuban Americans. Nor does it affect air and sea travel, allowing U.S. airlines and cruise lines to continue operating services to the island. As a result, some hotels will now be off-limits to Americans, though others run by Cuba's Ministry of Tourism will be permitted, potentially creating a major headache for visitors and the Treasury Department. The White House should create an app to help U.S. tourists stay away from 180 banned hotels and other entities on the restricted list, Kavulik suggested. So for anyone who is confused, U.S. citizens coming to Cuba can stay in the Hotel Santa Isabel but not the Ambos Mundos. Drink Havana Club rum but not Ron Varadero. Go to the Hemingway Marina but not the one in Cayo Coco. Got it. Patrick Oppman, CNN at CNN_Oppman, November 8, 2017. The so-called Cuba restricted list will be kept updated by the State Department and monitored by the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control OFAC, which handles U.S. sanctions. Travelers to Cuba who violate the list could face penalties, including criminal prosecution in cases of willful violations, according to one senior U.S. official briefing reporters. They will also be required to keep detailed records of their itinerary as well as receipts. U.S. companies will also be barred from investing in a new Mariel port development zone crucial to Cuba's economic plans to attract foreign investment. A Cuba expert in Miami, Emilio Morales, said the new rules will definitely cool the enthusiasm of many people to visit the island. While that would hurt the government, it would also negatively impact Cuba's private sector as well, he said. It's not as simple as Trump seems to think. There is a double hurt, Morales said, noting that some U.S. travel agencies specializing in Cuba would likely be forced to close as well. U.S. flights to Cuba have already been affected this year due to Hurricane Irma and a diplomatic row over alleged sonic attacks against U.S. diplomats that led to Washington issuing a travel warning for visitors to the island. Even so, the number of flights was way up on a year ago. One of the largest licensed tour operators issued a statement blasting the Trump administration for hypocrisy. At a time that President Trump is meeting with communist leaders in China and Vietnam, these regulations show the absolute hypocrisy and political pandering of the Trump administration on Cuba, said Cuba Educational Travel President Colin Laverty. The new policy rules are widely considered as payback by Trump to Cuban Americans who supported his candidacy, notably Florida Senator Marco Rubio, and were announced on the anniversary of the November 8 vote. However, Rubio and others had hoped Trump would take much stronger actions, and sever all diplomatic relations with Cuba. Today's announced regulations include some positive first steps, Cuban-American Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart said in a statement. I am disappointed, however, that the regulations do not implement what the president ordered. It is clear that individuals within the bureaucracy who support the former administration's Cuba policy continue to undermine President Trump. Frosty relations. Since Trump's Miami speech in June outlining his new Cuba policy, relations between the two countries have plummeted to their lowest point in almost a decade. It would be horrible to reverse course. Cuba's private sector fears arrival of Trump. Univision. Last month the U.S. State Department expelled more than half of Cuba's diplomatic and embassy staff in Washington in response to alleged sonic attacks on diplomats in Cuba that have affected at least 22 Americans, in some cases with serious health effects on their hearing, balance and vision. The Trump administration has also drastically cut its own embassy staff in Havana, suspending visa processing for Cubans. Both embassies are now left effectively running emergency services only. Cuba's foreign ministry initially protested the expulsion, calling it unfounded and unacceptable, denying it had not done enough to prevent the alleged incidents. It has since described the so-called sonic attacks as totally false and a political manipulation aimed at damaging bilateral relations. So far, none of the affected persons have come forward, fueling reports that they may have been U.S. spies. The diplomatic cuts have brought the two countries closer to the chilly state of relations they endured for decades until 2015, when they restored formal ties and reopened embassies in Havana and Washington. The U.S. also last month issued a travel warning to Americans to stay away from Cuba due to concerns that civilians in hotels may also have been affected by the sonic incidents. Cuba relaxes immigration rules, clearly concerned over the potential damage to its fast-growing tourism industry. Late last month, Cuba's foreign minister announced minor changes to the island's immigration policies, seeking to strengthen ties with the 800,000 Cubans living outside the country. The changes removed $125 immigration fee and allows children of Cubans residing outside the country and those born in foreign countries to obtain Cuban citizenship and identification documents. But many Cuban Americans say the Cuban government's measures do not go far enough and complain that its immigration rules still impose onerous costs on travel to the island, while discriminating against its own citizens in exile. Experts question if Trump's new Cuba policy is enforceable, and could create a backlash against the island's private businesses. While GAESA has a major stake in the tourism industry, it's hard to see how it can be effectively targeted by U.S. travel regulations. Cuba could simply opt to play a shell game and move some of the hotels or military and tourist companies, such as Gaviota, out of the military orbit, giving them new civilian corporate identities. Cuba could also simply place all non-American tourists in its military and hotels and reserve the civilian ones for U.S. visitors. In photos after Obama's visit, Cubans still waiting for change 6 months on, most Cubans are still waiting to see any concrete benefit from President Obama's historic trip to the island. Photo Pablo Casaglio Univision. Many Cubans still refer to Obama's visit optimistically as a watershed moment that at the very least marked an irreversible improvement in relations between the two countries. Photo Pablo Casaglio Univision. Cruise ships are now arriving in Cuba from the United States for the first time in half a century. Photo Pablo Casaglio Univision Des Lizaraki. As American tourists stepped off a cruise ship from Miami recently, photos were taken and a few dollars exchanged, a scene unthinkable even a few months ago. Photo Pablo Casaglio Univision. There is no question after the Obama visit that Cuba has turned its sights on the United States as a lifeline for its economy. Photo Pablo Casaglio Univision. Roosevelt Quignan, 37, said people made high expectations that when Obama came everything would open up completely. It's not like that. Photo Pablo Casaglio Univision Des Lizaraki. While many Cubans privately harbor strong feelings bordering on anger about the need for improvements to their quality of life, in public they tend to be more stoic about the pace of change. Photo Pablo Casaglio Univision. Besides the tourism sector, it's also been pretty slim pickings for U.S. corporations looking to invest in Cuba. Photo Pablo Casaglio Univision. Most of the tourists coming to Cuba hail from Europe or Latin America, but some say more and more Americans are showing up. Photo Pablo Casaglio Univision Des Lizaraki. We thought they would come quickly and so far we haven't seen any changes, said Yosel Betancourt, a 37-year-old bicycle taxi driver in a t-shirt and shorts hunting for clients to offer a ride in Havana's Central Park. Photo Pablo Casaglio Univision. At the end of the day what people need is for the doors that are closed to open so that the people can have a better life. That's what we want, said Betancourt, who complained he didn't have the money to buy his daughter a backpack and water bottle for the new school year. Photo Pablo Casaglio Univision. Before Obama arrived the conservative forces were trying to delay the process. They didn't like Obama's visit at all, said Carlos Alzugar, a retired Cuban diplomat in Havana. Photo Pablo Casaglio Univision Des Lizaraki. There's a saying in Cuba that there are only two seasons, summer and hell. Photo Pablo Casaglio Univision. At this time of year Havana's unrelenting heat and humidity, broken only by torrential thunderstorms, is always a test of patience for a long-suffering population mostly not equipped with air conditioning. Photo Pablo Casaglio Univision. In photos New York gifts Jose Marti statue to Cuba, with typos. Cuba unveiled the Statue of Independence hero Jose Marti October 20, donated by the Bronx Museum of the Arts in a gesture of international friendship that comes at a low point in relations between the two countries. Photo Reuters Univision. The original statue, sculpted by U.S. artist Anna Hyatt Huntington, stands at the south entrance to New York City's Central Park on the Avenue of Americas. It was unveiled May 18, 1965. In this photo the sculptor receives the City Medallion from Richard C. Patterson, Jr., Commissioner of Public Events for New York City. AP Photo App Univision. The plaque on the replica contains two typographical errors, spotted by Yoani Sanchez, founder of 14 a media website in Cuba. The word Nacia born should have an accent on the O not the I, and the word Ciudad City is misspelled. It should be Ciudad. Photo courtesy of 14 a Medio. Photo courtesy of 14y Medio Univision Des Lizaraki. The 16-foot bronze statue is a replica of one that portrays Marty, wounded, on a rearing horse in New York Central Park. It was funded with a $2.5 million campaign by the Bronx Museum and arrived in Cuba on October 3. Photo Ramon Espinosa. Univision Cuba says it will officially inaugurate the statue on January 28 when it marks the 165th anniversary of Marty's birth. Seen here before it was shipped to Cuba. Photo from Hit DPR Cubano. Ana Silvia Rodriguez Abascal, Deputy Permanent Representative of Cuba to the UN. Photo at DPR Cubano. Univision. Marty was fatally shot in 1895 as he fought to win Cuban independence from Spain. He is perhaps the most sacrosanct figure in Cuban history, respected for his eloquent poetry and essays and his sacrifice for Cuban independence. He also spent 15 years in exile in the United States, mostly in New York, making him a potent symbol of U.S.-Cuban relations. Photo Ernesto Mastroscasif. Univision Des Lizaraki. The statue was set on a black marble base outside the Museum of the Revolution, facing out toward the Bay of Havana. Photo Ernesto Mastroscasif. Univision. The statue arrived in Cuba October 3. The campaign to send the replica statue was launched at the height of the warming between the U.S. and Cuba that began under President Barack Obama in December 2014. Relations have plummeted since the election of President Donald Trump, who has pledged to reimpose strict limits on U.S. travel to Cuba and has cut staffing of the U.S. Embassy here by more than half. Photo at DPR Cubano Univision. The bronze replica was donated by the Bronx Museum of the Arts. Seen here before it was shipped to Cuba. Photo from Hit DPR Cubano. Ana Silvia Rodriguez Abascal, Deputy Permanent Representative of Cuba to the UN. Photo at DPR Cubano Univision. Des Lizaraki, Eusebio Leal, Havana's city historian, presented the statue to the local and international press in a preview ahead of its formal January inauguration. What meaning does it have? It reaffirms that, leaving aside deviations, beyond erratic policies, beyond those who try to destroy bridges and destroy the communication that exists between the nations, and between men, there is the belief that respect for the rights of others means peace. Photo Ernesto Mastras Casif Univision.